recording is going to be about the course of the Korean War as well as the results. We left off with the last one by saying that the attack began on June 25th, 1950, which is when forces from North Korea crossed the border into South Korea and launched a massive attack. It was something that took both of the superpowers by surprise, even though we can pretty much assume that the North Koreans had let the Soviets know, or there was some knowledge on the Soviets' part of this attack happening. But I think that the swiftness of it and the intensity of it surprised the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was at the time protesting against the UN because the UN had refused to admit the People's Republic of China. So therefore the Soviets had withdrawn their delegation from the UN in early 1950. So therefore they weren't in a position to counter the Americans maneuvering at the Security Council, which means the Americans could capitalize on the absence of the Soviet delegation at the UN and pretty much direct the UN's efforts towards what the U.S. wanted to do, which was to obviously stop the communist invasion and protect South Korea. Truman would now be able to use the UN to mobilize world opinion and to legitimize U.S. military intervention, and that goes along with the Truman Doctrine and also this whole idea of containment that we were now operating under, which was from the advice of George Kennan. At the same time as the North Korean attack took place, we were already reconsidering our whole strategy overall in the Cold War and expanding our commitment to containment to other parts of the world, not just Europe. At the beginning of 1950, President Truman authorized the National Security Council to undertake a secret reassessment of U.S. policy after the Soviets had successfully tested an atomic bomb in September of 1949 and after the Chinese emerged communists in October of 1949. This report is one of the most important reports of the Cold War. It was called NSC 68, which stands for National Security Council Report Number 68. This report was extensive. If you look back in your book on page 46, you can see information about the report as well as an excerpt from it. Pretty much the report warned of how all communist activity everywhere could be traced back to Moscow, which we know now is not true because even in China, the form of communism that was at place, which was Maoism, was not exactly the same as the form of communism in the Soviet Union. But we just assumed that all communism was communism and that everything was worked back to the main hub or nerve center, which was Moscow. Therefore, the report warned that this period of the Cold War could be indefinite and that we needed to be ready to meet every challenge promptly. It encouraged an increase of spending military-wise from $35 to $50 billion, and that therefore we could have the ability to launch massive military efforts to counter any type of communist threat anywhere in the world, which you can see here. We had to build up both our nuclear forces and our conventional forces to accomplish this. So this report, it's taking our position in the Cold War and expanding it to committing us further to any type of situation in the world where there's a communist threat at place. So this would make us completely involved in situations around the world where at one point in our history we had been isolated. So it's a direct 180. Truman was definitely impacted by this report, and this is shown in his quick reaction to when he found out about the North Korean attack and what he should try to do with it. Basically, he was at home in Missouri when the war broke out, and he rushed back to Washington to deal with this situation. He assumed that the Soviets were behind the attack, and because of the criticism of what had happened with his administration with China, he and his advisors immediately decided that they couldn't afford to lose to the communists again here in Korea. So at this point in domestic politics, with what was happening with the Red Scare and what was happening now internationally, Truman's credibility was at stake, and he had to prove himself at this point. At the UN Security Council, there was a special session arranged on what should take place, and there was a resolution that was pushed through that called for an immediate end to the fighting and the withdrawal of North Korean forces from South Korean territory. General Douglas MacArthur, who was the head of U.S. occupation forces in Japan, he was a hero from World War II, was ordered to send in supplies to aid South Korea and to protect American nationals that were trying to evacuate the country. 2 days later, with the assistance of the fact that the Soviet Union was absent in the Security Council, the U.S. won the Security Council's approval of a resolution that called on UN member nations to assist the South Koreans in resisting the invasion from the north. So it's really important that you understand that the Soviets had taken their delegation out of the UN, because if they hadn't, our country would not have been able to maneuver the UN to what we wanted to do, which was to stop the communist forces. We would have met a lot more opposition in the UN and might not have been successful. I also want to highlight the importance of the quickness with which Truman responded. Even before the passage of the second UN resolution, Truman already authorized the use of American air and naval power to slow the communist advance, which in the end proved to be completely sufficient, but this shows you that he was willing to act to prove his reputation as an anti-communist, and also to go along with this new report by the NSC, which suggested that we be more active in our stance against communism. Unfortunately for Truman, though, the forces of South Korea, which were poorly trained and poorly equipped, weren't really able to deal effectively with the North Korean assault. By June 28th of 1950, which was only 3 days after the war, the communist armies captured Seoul, which was the capital of South Korea, and it kind of seemed that it was only a matter of time before they could overrun the entire peninsula. 2 days later, after a quick trip to the combat zone, General MacArthur reported that the South Korean army couldn't hold out without direct commitment of U.S. combat forces. Because of how successful the North Koreans were, we were a little suspicious that the Soviets were trying to divert our attention from other places in the world, especially Europe, and make us go into Korea. And so Truman was a little hesitant to take a big step of combating or committing our U.S. combat forces. But he decided he couldn't wait any longer by June 30th, which was only 5 days after the start of the war, and he authorized the employment of American ground troops. So now this civil war in Korea had become an international conflict. We weren't quite sure how the Soviet Union would react to all this, because we had responded so rapidly, and we had successfully maneuvered the UN for our approval. The Soviet leaders didn't have a whole lot of room for any maneuvering on their part. But on June 29th, they officially disavowed any responsibility for the war and accused the South Koreans of having started the conflict and invading the North, which was not true, but that's how they tried to paint the situation. They also issued a warning against foreign involvement in Korea's internal affairs, and they said that their own intentions were not to intervene. Most importantly, they made no open movement to send in Soviet soldiers to assist the North Koreans, unlike us. Now, we know that they had trained these people in North Korea to be combat ready, but the Soviets weren't actually committing ground forces of their own to the North Koreans like we were for South Korea. This shows that the Soviets wanted to show caution at a time of international crisis, which occurred often during the course of the Cold War. We know they were trying to extend their influence and communism in general across the world, but when push came to shove, it pretty much showed that they were unwilling to run the risk of a direct military conflict between themselves and the United States. As the war continued, it was shown mostly to be an American affair, even though that this combat was conducted under the official auspices of the United Nations. It was mostly the Americans that helped to defend South Korea. And we can also see this because Truman had authorized the use of force without waiting for UN approval, which has happened quite a few times in our country's history, that we jumped the gun. Along with that, on July 7th of 1950, the UN command was officially created, and it was immediately placed under American authority. A total of 16 UN member nations eventually sent soldiers to help South Korea, but our forces were more than half of the ground troops and most of the air and sea power. Now let's take a look at the role of Douglas MacArthur. We know that he was a World War II hero from the Pacific Theater, and this is who Truman chose to be the Commander-in-Chief of UN forces in Korea. He had a long and spectacular career and had established himself as one of the leading military figures in American history. He was very smart, but he was also very vain, and he was eloquent in his speech, but also very arrogant. He was self-confident and self-righteous, but he had seen a lot of success under his leadership in the Pacific Theater of World War II. He was a hardcore conservative and a big-time anti-communist, and he was convinced that our policy in the United States was too much focused on Europe and not enough on Asia, which makes sense considering he served in the Pacific Theater during World War II and understood that part of the world better. When he assumed command, the situation of South Korea was pretty desperate. The first several weeks of the war, there was a string of victories on the North Korean part, and the South Korean army was in devastation and disarray, not really able to regroup and mount any type of resistance. American units were small and too poorly equipped to be much of a help, and U.S. air power was directed against strategic targets in North Korea instead of being used to actually slow the North Korean forces. By early August of 1950, the North Korean forces had controlled the entire peninsula except for a real small perimeter in the extreme southeast around the city of Busan. But at that point, the strategic balance was beginning to shift. Their lines as far as the North Koreans had been extended almost to the point of being overextended, and now there was increasing harassment from UN tactical warplanes that were proving to be an obstacle for the North Korean forces. They were finding it more difficult. On the ground, they were finding it much more difficult too, and soon they found themselves outnumbered. By the end of August, with a steady increase of UN soldiers, it gave the defenders of South Korea a numerical advantage. Plus, this perimeter that the North Koreans hadn't captured yet was now fortified with U.S. tanks and protected by U.S. aircraft, and it held out against a North Korean assault. So by early September, the offensive of the North Koreans came to end. They had come close, but had fallen short of a quick victory like they had planned. While all this was happening, there were secret plans being made for a surprise counteroffensive. MacArthur is the one who had experience with amphibious landings because of the battles in the Pacific during World War II, and he came up with the idea of staging this surprise landing behind enemy lines. By the end of August of 1950, his plans were complete, and on September 15th, 1950, this was a daring operation. The United Nations personnel began landing at a city called Incheon, which is a port city on the Yellow Sea located about 20 miles from Seoul and about 180 miles behind the North Korean lines. By the next day, another offensive was launched by UN troops in the Busan perimeter, which was that part that they hadn't captured yet. So within 2 weeks, the South Korean capital had been recaptured and the communist forces were in full retreat almost everywhere. This landing at Incheon seemed almost impossible, and I think that for most people it would have been impossible, but MacArthur knew how to engineer strategy like no one else. MacArthur was able to bypass the North Korean troops and cut them off. And if you look in your Cold War book on page 48, you can see the maps at the bottom and be able to locate where Incheon is, where the capital of South Korea, Seoul, was, as well as that area in southeast South Korea, the perimeter that the North Koreans hadn't been able to take. So it's pretty significant that MacArthur was able to pull off this amphibious landing, which led to our ability to retake most of the peninsula from the North Koreans. Because of this success, we began to expand our original objectives. So now, instead of simply defending South Korea, we made the decision to move into the north to try to destroy the Kim Il-sung communist regime and unite the entire peninsula under Syngman Rhee's control. And so this was definitely because of the success of the Incheon landing and MacArthur's push for us to become more involved in Korea that we made the decision to do this. During the next few weeks, UN troops pushed deep into North Korea, and it began to look like this goal would be achieved. And on October 19th of 1950, MacArthur's forces conquered Pyongyang, which was the capital of North Korea, and they were soon moving north towards the Yalu River, which is the division line between North Korea and Manchuria, China. Ignoring the counsels of caution from his superiors, General MacArthur pushed on toward what he hoped would be a swift and total victory. But the invasion into North Korea did not please Stalin or Mao, obviously. So let's look at their response. This was not a situation that they had anticipated by any stretch of the imagination. We've already said that the Stalin and the Soviets were a little bit cautious, and he was unwilling to commit his own forces, but he was willing to support any type of Chinese effort to prevent North Korea's collapse. And the Chinese were fearful that MacArthur might not stop at the Yalu River, and they weren't about to let their new communist country fall to MacArthur's control. In early October of 1950, the South Korean troops began crossing the 38th parallel. The Chinese foreign minister, Zhao Enlai, who was a kind of a right-hand man of Mao, he called in the Indian ambassador in the middle of the night to issue a pointed warning. If the non-Korean forces crossed that line, he said that China would join the war. The UN command dismissed this as a bluff and went ahead with its offensives deep into North Korea. Later that month, there was a dramatic meeting between Truman and MacArthur at Wake Islands. The general assured the president that the Chinese forces would be slaughtered if they dared to intervene. But there was evidence showing that China was massing its forces north of the Yalu River and had already begun infiltrating soldiers into Korea. The UN commander, MacArthur, remained undeterred. He grandly promised that the war would be over by Christmas, and that definitely sounds familiar. So we'll pick up next time with the results.